Paul?
Hello, success.
All right.
Can you hear and see me?
I can. Can you hear and see me?
Let me just turn the volume up a little bit. I think you took forever to join, so I was a little bit nervous, but I think here you.
I logged in about 4 minutes ago, I think. So.
Oh, right. Okay.
We'll see.
Yeah.
I don't know. Zoom recently updated for me. Maybe that's the problem. I don't know.
No, it all seems to be. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. All seems to be working fine. Anyway, how are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Good, good. Yes, thank you. Yes, yeah. Good. Thank you so much for doing this. Really grateful.
No, thank you. Thank you. This has been a wonderful kind of thing to push me to actually formulate, these ideas into a somewhat coherent package. We'll see. Somewhat coherent.
Yeah, no. Well, I say grateful for you sharing it with us at this point, which is always nice. And you're concluding our 8 weeks of talks, which is lovely. Yeah.
Oh, that's so nice. Yeah. Well, I'll say so when everybody gets here again. But really, thank you so much for inviting me to give the talk, and it is an honor, and it's been very good for me to work on the talk. So thank you for that.
Very good, excellent. Yeah, we've already got people rushing into the waiting room. So, but I won't open up until a couple of minutes before the hour. Yeah. How are things there?
I mean, they're semi-apocalyptic, but okay. We have more wildfire smoke from Canada, so.
Oh gosh, yes, of course, yes. Oh.
Yeah, and clouds of tiny bugs. So
Wow.
I don't know if you've ever been to a Passover Seder, but there is a point at which you enumerate the plagues that God sent on the Egyptians, and I kind of thought, okay, we have darkness, gnats. When do we get to frogs or water turning into blood?
Well, it can only be a matter of time. So, but it all turned out well in the end. So
it's true. You just have to, follow Moses through the Red Sea.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah, as long as you're with the right person, it's fine. Yeah. Would you like to share your screen just so that we can make sure that's all working?
Yeah.
Fine.
Host.
Oh, no, hang on. I have to give you permission. There we are.
Already. Okay. Yeah. And I can sort of set this. I guess I go into the presentation mode, and then do you see it as a presentation without?
Absolutely, look perfect. Yeah. Do you want to just press one forward just to make sure that's working?
I don't have any animations or anything.
Yep. Very good. No, that's all moving very nicely. So I think we're probably all set. Lovely.
Great. So I will maybe I'll stop.
Yeah, well, it's up to you really. If you wanted to just leave it up on the first slide, sure. And then you're all set to go really. Once I've let everyone in, obviously I'll do a proper introduction. But sure.
Okay, I will put that up then on the first slide and put it on presenter mode. Okay, so
definitely, yeah, perfect. Yeah, very good. And then let me just I'll just change my layout so I can see everybody when they come in.
I realize that in the background behind me are little pictures of the objects I'm going to be talking about today. So that's
yes. So that's yeah. Rather nice, sort of having that multiplicity of ideas all in one place.
Well, that's the thing with the molds and the plaques. I feel like you have to actually be looking at, you can't just sort of think about them in words. You have to look at the specific object, like you have to live with the pictures for a while.
Yeah.
Imagine
I mean, it's
reliefs, right? Like you probably did
something
with
maybe just you.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I keep cutting
No,
you
no,
off.
sorry.
It's so awkward.
I think there must be a slight delay, so I'll remember that on when I'm asking questions at the end. I was just going to say a question that has intrigued me, and it may be something you're going to touch on anyway, is, and I should probably save it for the end if not, but it was just really around how many molds, how many plaques do you think come out of a single mold?
Yeah, that is sort of the crux of it. And
yeah,
I won't jump ahead. That's at the very end of my slides, but I did do
no, fine.
Chart.
Yeah.
I did a little chart that compares the number of published plaques and the number of molds from a site. And it is striking how few molds there are. And also it's I mean, none of the ones that I'm working on, for none of them can I find a mold. It's a very rare thing. And in fact, I can't think of an example where we have both the mold and an impression from that mold.
Right. Yeah. Interesting.
I mean, it may very well exist because there are thousands of these objects and I don't know each of them very well, but it is not something that you often stumble upon. Kind of like seals and tablets, right?
Exactly. Yes. I mean, how often, how many examples have we got where we've got an actual seal and an impression? It's very true. Yeah.
So that's kind of, I take that as like a general parameter for us to be aware of, that these things do not work out in the way that we might assume, that you would want to have, say, one mold and then 100 plaques from that mold because you're trying to maximize your investment in the tools of production or something like that. That doesn't seem to
yeah. No, it's very interesting. Anyway, I'll save any other questions for the end, so we don't want to preempt anything. And we've got what tends to happen, at least in these few talks I've done here, is that most people pour in after the hour. So I'll let people in about a minute, and then we'll give it a few minutes to make sure we've got the audience in place. We've got 8 people at the moment, but we normally get up around 20 people or so. So that will be good.
Well, I have to say, ARWA does a great job of organizing and putting everything up on the website. It's not that often that I'm able to attend the talk live, but I have been able to watch them, and I'm so grateful for their organizational. I mean, who does that? Are you required to do that for the talks that you?
No, thank goodness. It's recording now, so all this will be cut away. and then it's posted, very neatly, and just the talk, none of the conversation either end. So it's they do a fantastic job.
They really do. It makes it so much easier to access because now we have all of these online talks, but often they're sort of just like in a big bag together, like just tossed in. And so I do really appreciate the archiving work that goes into the website.
No, it's very impressive, but nothing to do with me. So, yeah. Very good. Well, I think we've got a minute to go. So in case people start worrying, I'll let everyone in. And then, as I say, I'll give it a few minutes or a minute or so before we make an official start. I'll just let everyone in now.
Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm just letting people in, so we'll make a start in a minute or so to make sure we've got a full audience. Very good. Well, I think the initial rush is over. Now we have a trickle of people coming in, which I'll let in, but I'll think it's time to begin. We're over the hour, so it's my huge pleasure to welcome you all back to what is in fact the final talk in this particular series from the Art History Visual Studies section of the ARWA lecture series, Archaeology in Action. And so I'm absolutely delighted to welcome, as it were, our last speaker, at least for this session, friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Graff, to give her talk. I'm sure you all know Sarah, but let me tell you that Sarah joined the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art in 2007 and earned a PhD from NYU's Institute of Fine Arts in 2012. Her research explores the practical, cultural, and metaphysical uses of clay in Mesopotamia and also the world of ancient demons and monsters. She's taught at Cooper Union and the CUNY Graduate Center and has participated in archaeological excavations in Syria at Tel Mozan, ancient Urkesh. She works with several community-based partner organizations to expand access to the Met's collections and to explore cultural heritage connections between people and objects over time. So thank you so much, Sarah, for agreeing to share with us some of your thoughts in your current research, and look forward to hearing about from Girsu to Ur, tracing the circulation of old Babylonian terracottas in southern Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really want to extend my sincere thanks for this invitation, and to ARWA as well for hosting my talk and for their excellent work in disseminating these talks and archiving them, importantly, so that they're so accessible to us online. And before I start, I just want to give special thanks to my colleague, Stephanie Langenhooper at Southern Methodist University, and my colleague, Victoria Shaheen, ceramic artist and teacher at Greenwich House Pottery here in New York City, both of whom I've had the privilege of starting to explore these questions with. So as I say, this is very much a work in progress, and any mistakes are my own, but I am deeply grateful to Stephanie and Victoria for looking at these fascinating objects with me. And I'm also very grateful to my colleagues in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art here at the Met for their helpful comments and support. Today, as my title says, I'll be tracing the circulation of old Babylonian mold-made terracottas from Girsu to Ur. I hope to demonstrate that terracotta plaques and inscribed bricks are evidence for the movement of people from Girsu to Ur in the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium BC, and also to explore how this movement was materialized through networks of related terracotta plaque imagery. Investigating the objects that trace this connection between the two cities raises important questions about how mold-made clay plaques were manufactured and copied, whether mass production is an accurate way to describe this area of craft activity, and how these objects can help us move closer to an understanding of molding clay as a dynamic and agentive process, both in its essential qualities and in an ancient Mesopotamian context. So we'll start by We'll start with an orientation in space. We are in southern Iraq, and we're looking in particular at these two sites, which I've highlighted in the little inset map, modern Tello, ancient Girsu, and ancient Ur, Tel Mukhair. And furthermore, in addition, we'll be looking closely at objects from Dikdika, which is a suburb of Ur. If you can see my pointer here, this slightly northwestern suburb of Ur, which, as you can see, sits on a confluence of multiple ancient watercourses. The cities of the ancient state of Lagash are over here on this branch of canals extending from the Tigris. You see over here the area that we're talking about, and notice that they are not terribly close to each other, nor are they directly accessible through canals for each other, which is an important point. In terms of the time periods that we're covering today, I just show a very rudimentary chronology chart here. We'll be starting in the Akkadian period, but we will not be spending much time there. And we will pass through the periods up through the Old Babylonian. So this quick succession of different chronologies gives some hint to the instability and constant change that characterized this time period at the end of the third millennium and the beginning of the second millennium BC. So the technology used to make mold-made figurines and plaques first appeared during the Akkadian period, which I'm showing here, a figurine interestingly made in a double mold that comes from Akkadian levels at Tel al-Walaya. So at this early point, these figurines the repertoire was confined to these nude female images, and only in the subsequent or three period did that repertoire expand into other types of imagery, and then in later periods fully exploded in terms of its iconographic variety. So brick stamps were also developed during this time period, and they are an interesting and allied technology because both brick stamps and molds are providing different ways to shape clay. So with the stamp, you press into the damp mud brick rather than filling the mold with lumps of clay. And I'm showing you here a Naram-Sin mold on the left and a Naram-Sin stamp on the left and a Shar-Kali-Shari stamp on the right. So you can see that the composition did become tighter over time in the progression through the Akkadian dynasty. And then, as I mentioned, subsequent periods saw an increase in production and an expansion of the iconographic repertoire, which I'm just showing some different types of mold-made terracotta imagery here from this span of time covering the Ur III through Is and Larsa through Old Babylonian periods. The Is and Larsa periods and the early Old Babylonian period probably marked the height of this production, both in terms of volume and variety. And there was a decrease in production toward the later Old Babylonian period. Many scholars use the shorthand of Old Babylonian period mold-made terracottas to refer to these objects. And I am in fact doing that here myself. But the chronology is complex, and we won't be getting into that today. I just want to indicate that there's significantly more complexity than I'm able to show in this talk. This was a time of great upheaval in southern Iraq, characterized by rapidly shifting political situations. We have texts that record conflicts among the city-states and between settled and semi-nomadic groups, as well as military incursions from the sealand rulers in the south. There was a great deal of political complexity tying in with that chronological complexity that we similarly won't be able to get into today. But I just want to note the chaos and instability that characterized this period, which includes the large-scale movement of people in response to military actions, such as the damming of the Tigris by Hammurabi's grandson, Abi-Ashur, which I show you here, this map that shows the position of that Tigris dam and the paired forts built by Abi-Ashur across the Tigris and Euphrates, and the diversion of Tigris flow into the Euphrates in order to cut off those flows of water further to the south, and thus cut off water to the sealand. So as they were well aware, the control of water flows from north to south imposed life or death pressures on those living downstream. And it was not coincidental that it was this time when the cities of Lagash shrank precipitously. So the question for me is, where did the people go and what traces did they leave? What paths did they take? Average people are notoriously difficult to find in the archaeological record, but perhaps we can gain some insight by looking at everyday artifacts like these plaques. If we look more broadly at sites where many plaques have been found, we can start to trace webs of connections among these as well. So I'm just going to show a couple different exemplary groups. These are really fascinating. These images that I believe show a temple facade. There have been a number of very interesting interpretations, which again, that would take us into a whole other talk of its own, but I tend to agree with Marie-Thérèse Barrelet, who saw these as a representation of a temple facade in this kind of composite perspective. So showing from the front door of the temple into the cella. Ursula Seidel has cataloged 28 examples of this image. And among the excavated plaques, 10 of them come from Isin, which is a significant concentration. 4 come from Nippur, and 1 from Kish, and 1 from Babylon. And in this group that I'm showing you here, there are also very interesting traces of the sequence in which they were made. So you can tell, I think, just from a visual inspection that these are very similar in their details, suggesting that they were made, let's say, following the same image. I'm not going to say in the same mold for reasons that will become clear further later in the talk. But if you look at specific areas of each plaque, you notice very small details here and here, where the scale pattern in this lower panel here, which appears unbroken in these examples, and this, of course, is damaged, so you can't see that part of the plaque. These are complete, the scale patterns are whole, whereas in these two, the scale pattern, presumably in the mold, had been broken in such a way that it results in this sort of linear feature rather than the subdivided scales. But it's the identical nature of these two plaques that's so interesting. So if you can imagine a mold being used for these and then breaking and then later being used for these, that's the kind of sequence that you can start to maybe uncover by looking very closely at how all of these images relate to each other. Another interesting grouping are these paired bullmen with standards. Unfortunately, only one has been excavated. I'm aware of 4 different examples, 2 of which are unexcavated, and one showing you here from Isaac's collection in Chicago, which was purchased in the field and probably comes from Ishali, along with the excavated example. Elise Auerbach, for her dissertation, measured very precise areas of these two plaques and determined that they had been made in the same mold. So it's an interesting grouping that could then be extended outward to the unexcavated examples to determine whether these as well were made in the same mold. And I just show 3 instances of this very interesting image type from Mari. 6 of these plaques were excavated in the palace at Mari that similarly show these paired figures grasping a standard with a solar symbol at the top. They are obviously very different in a lot of respects, but the fact that they share the same organizational scheme raises interesting questions about whether you can trace the connection among the Bullman plaques and then these plaques from Mari. But as has long been observed, the most distinctive connections are between Girsu and Ur, which Ruth of Fishus noted as early as 1961 in her book on Old Babylonian Terracottas. And I just want to say that this is especially noteworthy because the sites aren't really that close to each other. And if you put it into Google Maps, you actually get, an indication of how long it would take to walk on modern highways. But I think the estimate would be that it would take maybe 2 days to walk between these sites during the time period that we're talking about. So close proximity can't really explain these connections in the terracottas between these 2 places. And in addition, there's another wrinkle, which is that matching up terracottas with identical imagery doesn't necessarily prove that they were made in the same mold. They could have been made in the same place from the same mold, or made from a copy of a plaque which produced a new mold based on the original image. And I know very quickly this starts to become sort of a dizzying house of mirrors. So I'm going to walk through the process of making a mold. In order to make a mold, the craftsperson has to either carve an image in the negative directly into damp or partially dry clay, or press a lump of damp clay over a positive image, which is usually referred to as an archetype. So that archetype can form the basis for what the mold then adheres to, and then the mold can be lifted off of that archetype and used. But as you see in this example from the Penn Museum, you can also combine these techniques. So you can block out the general shape of the figure by molding over an archetype, and then add details directly into the mold itself, carving into it in the negative with a tool. And I think that it's clear from this image how we determine that that's been done, but you can kind of see the raised lip at the edge of these linear details, which shows you how that clay was displaced by carving into the mold, which is a very different appearance than, for instance, the necklace here, where you can see how that positive shape has been pressed into the mold rather than carved out. But once a mold has been made and plaques have been produced in the mold, these plaques can then go on to serve as the basis for additional molds, if someone wants to use them as an archetype to begin the mold making process all over again. A mold made in this way would then produce plaques in a different generation from the first mold. And this process can be repeated additional times to create additional generations. We can only determine whether plaques with very similar imagery were made in the same mold or in molds from different generations by comparing the measurements of specific areas on the plaques. If the plaques are from the same generation, their measurements will be nearly identical, whereas plaques from subsequent generations will be slightly smaller. The shrinkage from one generation to the next seems to be fairly consistent at around 12%. This is the result that Marie-Thérèse Barchelet found when she was investigating the proportional relationships between generations of molds in the course of compiling her monumental 1968 catalog of Old Babylonian terracottas. Bachelet consulted with experts and experimented with making molds and plaques herself. And she did indeed find this shrinkage of about 12% from an archetype to the plaque produced from the subsequent mold, with an approximately 6% reduction of size at each stage of the process. So the mold is 6% smaller than the archetype, and then the figurine produced from the mold is 6% smaller from the mold itself. So building on these results, I have closely examined and measured several of the plaques in these groups of related terracottas in order to determine whether they're likely to be from the same mold. Bachelet's suggestion of a 12% shrinkage between generations seems to be borne out by my preliminary results, with the caveat that some measurements are so small that there's a large possibility for error. So looking at the first group, these Humbaba faces comprise a group of 4, 3 of which were excavated at Girsu and 1 at Ur. And based on their dimensions, I would suggest that the examples from Girsu were made in the same mold, and then the example from Ur was made in a subsequent mold because it is slightly smaller. I do want to thank Katie Blanchard from the Penn Museum for measuring this object for me over Zoom, but I do want to say that I should go and measure that myself before making that a solid conclusion. Bachelet noted the similarities among the 3 from Girsu in her 1968 catalog, but she suggested that this one here was slightly larger and thus from a different generation of the mold. However, the measurements that I took myself do not support this suggestion, but it's possible that she and I measured different areas of the plaques. They are subject to warping when unmolding, so that's another feature that introduces uncertainty into this comparison of measurements. Another group of related plaques from Girsu and Ur are these plaques of an embracing couple. And I include the one in my own collection at the far right, even though it is unexcavated, but it's a very interesting object in comparison to these other 3. I think that you can see that the woman carries this small purse here. And I hope to look into that a little bit more in subsequent research. In this case, the dimensions suggest that the Ur plaque, again, is a copy of one of the plaques from Girsu because of that proportional relationship. Also, the slightly reduced detail, which I think you can see in this image in the Ur example, suggests that it was produced from a mold made by pressing clay over a positive image, perhaps even by someone who was not a skilled artisan. So they've lost some of that surface detail. And then the final group that I'm going to introduce here are these images of the bull-eared god, this really very common image in Old Babylonian terracottas, still somewhat mysterious, but found in many examples. Here you can see that they resemble each other very closely and do seem to derive from the same plaque or generations of plaques. So there are 4 that come from Girsu and 2 from Ur, 1 unfortunately location unknown. And Bachelet, in her catalog of the examples from Girsu, suggested that there was already at least 1 generation of copies among the Girsu examples themselves. So it would be very interesting to measure the Ur example and see if that was yet smaller than all of the examples from Girsu. But I do want to say that there, as I mentioned at the beginning to this section, that there are real difficulties with measuring such small areas on irregularly shaped objects. And I've concluded that 3D scanning these objects would probably be a more productive approach, but it presents obvious logistical difficulties when accessing objects in museum collections. So I would say this is a problem as yet to be solved. So if we accept that there's evidence of movement between Girsu and Ur, how do we go further and start to investigate which direction people were moving in and when? I believe there's an important clue to be found in the puzzling movement of two inscribed bricks, both brought from Girsu to Ur. These bricks date to the reigns of two members of the so-called Second Dynasty of Lagash, and those are Gudea's successor, Girsu II, and the last member of this so-called dynasty, Namakni. So I've just highlighted those names in the list. First, there is this brick that is cataloged as the second inscription of Girsu II in the publication by Edzard. The content of the inscription records Girsu building Ningirsu's Gigun. 10 objects were excavated that have this inscription, including, interestingly, a brick stamp, which you'll see is the last entry in this catalog here. It's in the collection of the Iraq Museum. One of the bricks was found in Ur near the house site, and notice that it's inscribed rather than stamped. So this brick is stamped. There is a brick stamp that exists with this inscription, and then there's also a fragmentary inscribed, not stamped brick that comes from Ur. And then there is another brick, the second inscription cataloged of Namakni, and the text describes Namakni building Ningirsu's Eininu and the Gigun within it. There are two objects only with this inscription, one brick from Girsu and one from Dikdika at Ur. And both are inscribed rather than stamped. But note that the brick excavated in Girsu, so the one that was still in the place where it had been first laid as part of the building construction, seems to have been reused as a door socket, judging from the damage to its uninscribed face. So if you turn it over, you see this circular depression in the back of the brick. In both cases, a large, heavy brick with an inscription that is specific to a temple in Girsu was taken to Ur. Why? Baked bricks are often reused locally, but the distance from Girsu to Ur seems too far. Again, just bringing this up for this explanation to make sense. Also, the Girsu bricks at Ur were not found together with others with identical inscriptions. So remember, each of them is the sole instance of this brick from Ur. So it's unlikely that their reuse at Ur attests to significant mining of bricks from decrepit buildings at Girsu. Instead, they seem to have been deliberately taken from one city to the other. I don't understand why this happened, but I would say that it's clear that the movement from Girsu to Ur was purposeful and meaningful. Additionally, as I mentioned, the Namakni brick which remained at Girsu seems to have been reused as a door socket, which also indicates that a particular importance was attached to this brick, despite the practical unsuitability of a brick for this purpose, as demonstrated by the large crack which likely resulted from the pressure and movement of the doorpost. And I'd like to thank Mahmoud Alassi from the Louvre for discussing this very enigmatic object with me. An interesting detail from the 2016 excavation season at Girsu provides another attestation of the meaningful reuse of an inscribed brick in the area of the Eininu itself. A brick with an inscription of Gudea recording his work on the Eininu was found deliberately placed in a central spot within the chapel room, and some of its signs seem to have been re-incised at a later date. In the excavation report, John Taylor writes that, quote, "It appears that during the rebuilding of this room during the Ur III period, a particular brick was found that for some reason as yet unknown was considered to be special. The combination of the unusual features of the brick and its careful placement point to a specific practice associated with this brick, although its interpretation remains a mystery," end quote. Without overstating the case, I think that the meaningful reuse of inscribed Girsu bricks can be identified during the late 3rd and early second millennium BC and should be further studied. To sum up, when we see evidence of impracticality in the archaeological record, we should pay attention to it. In the case of the 2 Girsu bricks found at Ur, someone made the impractical choice to carry a heavy brick from one city to another. What we can take from this is a connection between the 2 cities moving in the direction from Girsu to Ur, but we can't yet understand this connection further. Which other objects were known to have moved between Girsu and Ur? Eva Andrea Brown Holtzinger's catalog of abducted building and votive inscriptions of the rulers of Lagash is a valuable contribution on this topic. Among the 34 objects she includes in her study, 15 were found at Ur, the most from any single site. Most of the objects were conical inscribed clay nails or cones. There were also some vessel fragments and statues and some bricks, including the 2 just discussed. The objects from stratified contexts come from 7th or 6th century BC levels, giving the terminus antiquem for their movement. Brown-Holtzinger argues that these objects were moved in this period as a result of major building renovations during the Neo-Babylonian period, which turned up much earlier inscribed material. However, when we look at the movement of inscribed objects from the cities of Lagash to Ur, together with the connections I traced earlier between early second millennium terracottas from Girsu and Ur, I think we need to come to a different conclusion about timing than Brown-Holtzinger does in her study. I believe that the plaques provide convincing evidence that significant movement was occurring not as a result of renovations of ancient sites in the south during the Neo-Babylonian period, but in fact during the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium BC, much closer to the time when the inscribed objects were first made. If inscribed objects had been discovered through the deep excavation of older buildings in the process of renovations, why would they have been moved to a different site? It's not impossible that they would do so, but I would like to question the assumption that renovation would necessarily lead to the removal of objects from the building under investigation. In fact, if we read the building inscriptions of the Neo-Babylonian kings, we would expect that they piously reburied inscribed objects associated with their predecessors in the foundations of the buildings that they restored. So that argues against the movement of these objects during that time period. Furthermore, the movement of terracotta plaques between sites was almost certainly happening during the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium. Mold-made plaques are a form of artistic production firmly associated with a specific time period, and it's unlikely that they would have been copied even in the early 1st millennium. The plaques that I would argue originated in Girsu and were copied and taken to Ur thus provide a sort of time capsule that situates this movement in a particular chronological moment. It would be logical to believe that the mold-made plaques were just one stream in a larger movement of objects from the cities of Lagash, Girsu in particular, to Ur, a movement that importantly must have extended to people as well. So looking at how these objects moved also requires a greater understanding of how they were made. As mentioned earlier, Bachelet consulted with experts and did her own experiments in forming a mold over an archetype. However, since her study, there has not been a great deal of additional experimental investigation into the manufacture of Old Babylonian mold-made terracottas, with a few notable exceptions, such as the 6-week experimental workshop at the University of Strasbourg in 2015. And I've included the link to the video documenting this workshop, which is really wonderful and informative. Barley's conclusion from her own investigations was that most molds were made by carving directly into the mold in reverse, not by molding over an archetype. I think that most molds were probably made with a combination of different techniques. A common sense conclusion also reached by Agnes Viquet in her study of the Sousa figurines, for example. When Victoria Shaheen and I examined this Humbaba plaque in the collection of the Met, she was able to identify that certain features, such as the hair, which I'm showing enlarged here, have soft edges indicating that they were formed over an archetype. So you see it just kind of melts into the background here, indicating that there's not a hard edge that would have resulted had that image been carved directly into the mold. While the ears were carved into the mold directly in contrast, and you can see that most clearly with this ear, the crispness of the outline. So Victoria suggested that the ears were the most fragile part of the image since they're right at the edge of the plaque. So this part of the mold may have been damaged during its creation, or forming the mold, if it were formed over an archetype, forming the mold over this delicate feature in a vulnerable spot right at the edge of the design produced unsatisfactory results that had to be gone over after lifting off the archetype. So really this much more fluid relationship between molding over and carving in is likely to have been pretty common. Preliminary results from comparing the dimensions of the Girsu and Ur plaques suggest that examples were made by molding over the Girsu examples, not by carving directly into the mold. And these could be unofficial copies made by ordinary people, not trained craftspeople, since they were made in a technique that was more accessible than creating a mold from scratch. This is an important directional indicator that the movement, as with the bricks, goes from Girsu to Ur, but more research needs to be done on comparing related plaques. So I'm now going to share some concluding thoughts on the problems with mass production and molds. The conventional understanding of mold-made terracottas is that they're mass-produced consumer goods. An especially clear statement of this position can be found in Agnes Piquet's 1986 article on a mold from Susa, which provides evidence that a characteristic hand-modeled type of figurine was subsequently also produced by molding, which is a very interesting development of the transition between these two different types of making figurines. Piquet sums up the transition in my translation, quote, "We have then an important example of a change in technique necessitated no doubt by the increasing demand that is a condition of all progress," end quote. I cite her statement not to criticize or single her out, but because it's concise and clear. However, the idea that mold-made terracottas would naturally displace those made by hand in response to increased demand because of their greater efficiency should be carefully examined. Working ceramics artists tend to strongly disagree with the notion that molds are time savers. In fact, press molding requires intensive investment in the craftsperson's time and skill, as does hand forming. However, in areas unrelated to increasing efficient production, molds can do certain important things that hand modeling can't. They can produce seriality. They can produce a sense of connection between those who have and use the same image. And I'm just showing these bull-eared god images because they so clearly give this impression of seriality, of things that are different things, but are still the same, that they embody that paradoxical unity and difference. They can also problematize the relationship between the artist's hand and the finished creation. By using a mold, is the artist's hand erased or is it emphasized? In trying to understand this, we can notice, for instance, the many fingerprints on mold-made plaques which aren't smoothed down. And Stephanie Langenhuber has done some very interesting research and writing on this phenomenon of retaining traces of manufacture in much later terracottas. She argues that this was a choice made deliberately for several reasons, including marking the figurine as, quote, "a social object which has been touched before by other hands and will likely be touched again in the future," end quote. I see no reason that this could not also have been the case with the earlier mold-made terracottas as well. To understand what is happening between these plaques, we have to consider the role of people in their story, those who use the images and those who make them. Are these terracottas a way to make personal connections tangible between those who are separated from each other? Would this be a way to materialize connections across time, across space, or both? Since their production is relatively short-lived, I would consider them to primarily function across distance rather than time. So perhaps people with intimate connections who were separated from each other used these related images as a way to maintain their sense of connection, as a tangible thing to hold on to in the absence of the people themselves. In order to understand how these serial images may have worked in their ancient context, we need to investigate the evidence for how clay and molds worked in mythological texts. These are a great source of insight for how people in ancient Mesopotamia understood the creation of life in particular. And the old Babylonian period myth of Enki and Ninmah is a particularly rich source. So I'll just give a short summary and put up this informative page with information on the different manuscripts. In the story begins with Enki successfully directing the creation of humans by his mother, the goddess Nama, from Apsu clay. The gods celebrate the creation of humans by throwing a feast, and Enki and the mother goddess Ninmah get drunk and challenge each other to produce creatures for which the other will have to decree a fate. So Ninmah goes first and she produces 7 creatures. Enki succeeds in finding roles for each of these, even though each of them has a physical difficulty of some type which he must overcome. Then Enki creates and impregnates what seems to be a human woman who gives birth to a creature named Umul, who is unable to do anything at all, even lift up his head or eat food. The mother goddess despairs and Enki wins the contest. So in discussing this myth, I'm indebted to Andy Kilmer's perceptive analysis, especially her argument that Umul is a baby. I think that there's a fair amount of humor actually in the idea that the birth goddess is flummoxed when she first encounters a baby, but let's remember this is the first baby that has ever been born. And anyone who's ever been responsible for a newborn can probably relate to her feelings of helplessness and this feeling that this must be the first time anyone is ever encountering this difficulty. There are 2 different types of creation demonstrated in the myth, which we could perhaps characterize as hand modeling in the case of Ninmah, creating all of her creatures, and mold making in the case of Enki. So Ninmah makes them each individually, but Enki figures out how to create a mold in the form of a womb, which reacts with his semen to form new life that becomes self-perpetuating and doesn't require as much intensive work and divine intervention. And just note that it would be characteristic of Enki, who has the most concern for humanity among all the great gods, to share his knowledge of the divine secret of creation with humanity. So what does this mean for our understanding of molding? I think it means that the process was itself meaningful and that molds are ideologically important rather than simply useful tools. And I will just note that this seems to make sense with the interpretations of, for instance, Julia Asante, who argued that molds are faithful to an underlying model that may exist only in the divine realm. So that divine aspect to the molds, I do think that that's compatible with this type of interpretation. And similarly, Lisa Rossberger has argued that the hand-modeled figurines were meant to represent individuals, while the plaques reference symbolic ideals. Likewise, I think that this interpretation could fit with the kind of interpretation I'm arguing here for the conceptual importance of molding. With all this focus on the molds, a persistent question arises of where they are. And you'll see from this chart that very few molds have been excavated in comparison with the enormous numbers of excavated plaques. And it's possible that this relates to the incomplete preservation of objects from archaeological context. Perhaps molds were overlooked or not objects of great interest in earlier excavations. but it does seem to be consistent that where there are hundreds or even thousands of plaques, there are molds only maybe in the double digits. The question of where the molds went remains an open one, although my collaborators and I have some ideas which we hope to develop further and look forward to sharing soon. Additionally, if they were mass-produced objects, why are there so many similar plaques and so few duplicates? And here I'm showing you Elisa Rosberger's appealingly varied chart showing the many different types of what she calls goddess in a structure plaques. So that you can tell that they're all the same image, but they're all different. In fact, Bachelet was surprised at just how few serial reproductions of the same image she encountered in compiling her catalog. Since we know that there are very few plaques with duplicate imagery, this allows us to rule out one potential scenario, namely that one mold was not being used to produce many identical plaques, or used as a source for multiple generations of molds, as was the case much later in dedications to Greek sanctuaries during the Archaic period. Rather, plaques with many of the same types of images were produced by molds that differ slightly but distinctively from each other. This suggests, in fact, the opposite of mass production, meaning that many different molds were produced when few would have sufficed. As a corollary, when exact serial reproductions do occur, as they do in the groups of plaques from Girsu and Ur that we've looked at today, this repetition is unusual and thus, I would argue, significant. So the conclusion that I draw from this is that making the impression was itself a meaningful act, and making the mold was also a meaningful act that drew upon layers of mythological references to acts of creation, with particular reference to the wisdom and inventiveness of Enki. So, molds were carefully chosen and used, and small differences aided in the creation of a sense of community and connection among people by balancing commonality with individuation. And secondly, I don't see any evidence that molds were used to mass produce objects offered for a consumer market, which seems to me to be a projection backwards into the past of our current cultural norms. And I just ask who would have bought these plaques and where would they be offered and for which purposes? Perhaps they were offered at temples as part of kind of this pilgrim souvenir or marker of a particular vow or votive offering, but other than that, I don't really see them as being something that responds to a consumer market. So in conclusion, I would argue that we need to pay close attention to these objects themselves in their particularities, including identifying clusters of related images to try and get a better sense of the people behind the plaques. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much for that wonderful talk, hugely stimulating and really challenging so many sort of traditional perceptions of what plaques were about, and lots of virtual hand clapping in the audience there. So again, many, many thanks. I'm sure there will be thoughts and questions that have come out of this. So please do, if you have a question or any comments, either raise your hand or simply turn on your mic and video, which you should be able to do. And Sarah is here. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question?
Well, I see that there's a comment in the chat about how the stamped bricks were produced. Should we take
Very
that?
good.
Is that okay?
Shall we start with that, and then I'll come to Trudy, who's got her hand up here. So, yeah. Oh, and Beata as well. Very good. So let me just start with the chat question, which is the stamped brick was produced in the same way as the terracotta plaques, that is, as a first copy from an archetype. Then that must be used to create a copy, since the mirror image would be read backwards.
So this is a really important and interesting point of this whole mirror image, which obviously becomes much more pressing in the case of text that needs to be read. I have not focused as much on brick stamps, but I will say that they were produced in a variety of different ways. They don't seem to have been produced in the same way of forming over an archetype. There are, in some cases, even sort of movable type, as I see John Taylor has his hand up and he's written about that. There are small sort of pieces of type produced in, I believe, bronze that can be used to stamp bricks. And then the stamps that I was showing were not formed by pressing into a positive, but were formed in some fashion in the stamp itself, by carving into, building up and carving into the clay, which was then fired. But it's fascinating, this kind of back and forth between the positive and the negative that I think you see in both cases with the molds and with the brick stamps. But clearly different technical requirements in these cases, where one was creating a linear impression in, and the other one was building up volumetric forms in the mold. And if someone else, maybe John, wants to address this question of how the brick stamps were made, I would welcome that addition to the discussion. Not to put anyone on the spot.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Sorry, I have no idea.
Yeah. Oh, right. It's a quick answer from John. Thank you. Let me take the questions in order of the hands appearing. So Trudy Kawami first, and then Beata Pankratz-Leisten, and then John. So Trudy, would you like to go ahead?
Okay, for some reason, I can't seem to turn my video on. I just wanted to say that I have been looking at one small class of the terracotta plaques, and I totally agree with you that the plaques were not mass produced as we think of mass produced, but they were for a variety of reasons and by a variety of different people. And I came to this conclusion by looking at a very small subset. So I'm delighted to hear that you've come to a similar conclusion. Life and culture was very complex. We think of them as simple people. Oh yeah, they were all, or three people, or they were old Sumerians, or they were old Amorites. No, it was a real mix. And I think negotiating an identity in this mix may have something to do with these plaques. Anyway, I really liked your talk, and I will be in touch with you offline.
Thank you, Trudy, and thank you. I appreciate your comment, and I've drawn on your scholarship. I know the plaques you're talking about, and I'm eager to talk to you about them further.
Thank you so much. And Beata, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, so much for this fascinating talk. I'm also very intrigued by the idea that you don't think of these models as mass production. And I was wondering whether we could move for a moment away from the very materiality, because the imagery to me seems very much informed also by myths or mythic narratives or cultic practice or real in-depth knowledge of how to design the image of the divinity, as in these wonderful temple plaques. So to me, it seems that the producer were not only skilled craftsmen, but also informed by the cultural discourse. And I was wondering whether there's any way that with the excavation find spots, you can say something about the agency behind these, because if they moved from Girsu to Ur, is it with people who were engaged in the cult or in the service of the king or something, or were these craftsmen who carried their connoisseurship and how skills from one place to another? I think it would be wonderful if one could talk to these aspects.
Thank you, Beata. Yeah, thank you. I agree. I think we didn't get into the iconography much today at all, which is kind of like, I don't know, that's the big point of these. They're pure iconography. So it's a very different approach that's kind of sidestepping this enormous area of great interest. And unfortunately, this is always the case with the plaques. The fine spots are just so imprecisely known. I mean, in the earlier excavations, they were just kind of recorded as generally coming from, this area, or in the case of Dictica, there's no stratigraphy at the site. So they were just from Dictica, which doesn't really give us that much information. And I think more importantly, maybe rather than, because I've been so discouraged by this over the years that you can't really find a fine spot that will answer these questions of how were these used, who was making them. I've taken that to mean that these were just such dynamic objects that were always, we're just seeing this moment of the end of their life. But I think they had very active engagements with people throughout their, the fine spot. Yeah, it's just, but this is, I think I've almost moved to the point of not being bothered by that anymore, because there's such a small piece of the object's lifespan. And the thing that I will say is that they are very, very rarely found in graves. They are found in domestic contexts, in trash, in the street, very rarely found in temple contexts, and even more rarely found in graves. So,
this is exactly this is exactly what I'm wondering. If they are found, for example, in Ur in domestic context, whether it was in the house of the lamentation priest, for example, because that would tell us something. Or are they found together with tablets, or any other things in the configuration of the find context, which could tell us something?
I believe at Girsu they were found with tablets, but because the context was recorded so vaguely, I mean, this is in 1924 or something like that. We just don't really know what their specific, what was in that locus, what those tablets were. All of that tantalizing information is forever out of reach. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Beata.
Thank you so much. I don't know, John, your hand has gone down. I don't know whether, yeah, very good. You're on.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. Thanks for a fascinating talk, Sarah. I'll drop you a line. There are a few detailed points I won't bore everybody else with, but on a general point, I wanted to, I know I've been interested in bricks and cones and royal inscriptions that move around. It seems to happen quite a lot through all periods, and it seems to happen for different reasons. But one thing that occurred to me is that Megan Lewis started a PhD on this, so she might have a lot of interesting references for you. The other thing is what we said in the preliminary report for Girsu is only partly true. The business about it being recarved isn't true, and I also don't actually believe in movable type. This thing with the bricks, because what you see every so often on bricks, or also with cylinder seals, is that they struggle every now and then to write backwards, as it were. So every now and then something funny happens. It's an interesting phenomenon by the details, but more interesting perhaps is that some of the objects that came up at the recent Tello excavations, there were some cones that related to construction at Ur. So there are examples in the other way round. In the last season, there was a little bit of brick stamp, and it's reconstructed, but it's old Akkadian, and again, it seems to refer to the building of a temple at Ur rather than anything at Girsu, which is a slightly different thing to explain than cones. Again, yeah.
I mean, maybe that flow went back and forth a little bit more than I, could see in this evidence. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it gums the works up a little bit, but and it doesn't necessarily undermine your theory, but there's a lot of things moving around. I suspect it's sort of, perhaps they're closer on the canal than they seem to us. If you put a bunch of heavy things on a boat and wait a few days, maybe that's okay in their time frame, you know, with the slower pace of life, perhaps, I don't know. But anyway, fascinating talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much. And Joanne, please.
Yes, just building on the last couple of comments that have been made, I think it would be, start my video. Okay, just a minute. Okay. Building on that, there's an article that everybody should read. I keep advertising it over and over again. It's in the Reed Festschrift, and it's by Zerens, and he's talking about the new excavations and the texts from the new excavations at Lagash, and he's also connecting up the dots about this mystery 100 years or so that the Gudians were ruling. And what transpires, he's found evidence for the Gudians in the Ur cemetery. Specifically their arrowheads. They're also, they have hair, braided hair with rings on it, and they have atlatls. And you can connect them up as far afield as the BMAC, as far as who these people actually are. So this is new. Now, the interesting thing for you is that in the Gudian, the period of Gudi, which he dates to contemporary with Gudea, by the way, and his dynasty, which is where your bricks are from, there was a very close relationship between Ur and Girsu at that particular time. And there's lots of building being done in both places, you know, by the same people and under the patronage of the Gudian kings. So yeah, you should look into that article and see. I don't remember the exact details of it well enough to see how well it might help you, but I think it would be a very good thing to check out.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's really fascinating that there's, I mean, there does seem to be something that is coherent happening here. And if we could tie this with a particular moment, group of people, place, then I think that picture starts to come into focus. Thank you so much.
Think of Gudea. Yeah, so Gudea is basically a tributary of Gudians, is let's argue there. And that he's doing all his wonderful trade and so forth is under their aegis as well. In other words, they're providing the military muscle that makes it possible for him to have these far-flung trading connections. Okay, so anyway, you need to read the article. I think everybody needs to read this article, but you're right. So whatever.
There's several requests for a citation for that, but it's the Reed Festschrift, isn't it? The from I think.
Yes, that's correct. It's in the Reed Festschrift. Yes.
Was that correct?
Yeah, it is. That's correct. You're frozen, Paul.
Yeah, can I?
Okay, John Taylor has just put in the chat. Yeah, John Taylor has put in the chat the reference. If you can hear me, Paul. Yeah, okay.
Very good. Great. Thank you, John, very much. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. Yeah, good. Great. Thank you. Are there any more questions for Sarah?
I can't get this.
I'm fearful that I may have frozen and I'm talking into a
We can hear you, or I can hear you.
Oh, very good. All right. Thank you for letting me know. Good. Well, if there are no more questions from Sarah, it really just leaves me, of course, to thank her very much indeed for this this really terrific talk. I mean, it was so stimulating. And you know, a wonderful end, let's say, to this series of talks, which I've had the honor of chairing. And well, indeed, my thanks to all the speakers over the last 8 weeks for such interesting talks. And of course, they will be recorded and will be on the ARWA a YouTube site. So if you've missed anything during the talk, they will be available. But for the moment, my thanks to you for all attending. And again, Sarah, many thanks indeed for this stimulating lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I am extremely appreciative of everybody's attention and sharing their insights, questions, references. Thank you.